Welcome to the Times of Israel's What Matters Now. I'm your host, Deputy Editor Amanda Borschel-Dan, here with my former colleague, Mitch Ginsburg, who is today a producer at Israel's flagship podcast, Israel Story. So, hey, Mitch, thanks for joining me today.
Hi, Amanda. I'm so happy to talk to you.
Always. And listeners, I have to say, I'm so excited that you're tuning into today's episode. And what you're about to hear after our very short conversation is nothing less than a work of art. It's a work of art. It's sound art. It's poetry in sound. And just a little background. First of all, Mitch was the Times of Israel's founding military reporter, I believe. And at the same time, he is a longtime translator from Hebrew to English of really great luminaries of Hebrew literature. So this episode, Israel Story's most recent episode, The Hebrew Hobbit, kind of melds those two fields together in a weird way, wouldn't you say, Mitch?
Yeah, I mean, in a way that's exactly what I was hoping to do, actually. Both of those things really interest me, both, military stories, especially ones that have developed that happened 50 years ago or so, and also this incredible work of translation. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So let's kind of set the stage a little bit. And what's so exciting about this piece is it is on one level about the Hebrew translation of The Hobbit, thus the title, right? The Hebrew Hobbit. But on a totally different level, it's its own journey. It's its own there and back again of The Hobbit. It's these guys, these soldiers who were captured and taken to an Egyptian prison, as you said, 50 years ago, and they were set free on November 16th, 1973. And I really loved, actually, that you began the piece with that moment, with the moment of their freedom. So while we're in suspense the whole way through, and this episode that we're about to hear is about an hour and 20 minutes, if I'm not mistaken. It is really long, but I listened to it with bated breath, as they say, and it just moves like you wouldn't believe. So let's talk about the cast of characters a little bit. There are like 5 main characters who appear throughout the program.
Right. Those are, let's say, 5 out of around 10. There was a little bit of shuffling within because some of the POWs actually were returned before and didn't take part in the translation. But generally speaking, for most of the time, there were 10 Israeli soldiers. Very few of them were captured together. So they sort of fell one after the other into Egyptian hands. At times, it was like the Egyptians shooting down some of our top pilots in the Air Force, flying the best fighter jet that we had at the time, the Phantom, 3 of those pilots. And at other times, it was an ambush that Egyptian commandos sprung on 2 guys who were selling snacks in what's called a Shechem, like a mobile canteen. So the group was very varied. And they all found themselves at first taken hostage or taken as prisoners of war. And then after some time, they were all brought together in a single cell.
Right. And it obviously is not comparable to what our today hostages are going through, but they did not have it easy and they were tortured. And I heard you say that one of the members of this minyan of translators, wannabe translators or de facto translators, actually refused to speak with you. And he said today, especially with what's going on with the hostages, it just hurts his soul to think about it at this point. So just to make that clear, because the story itself sounds like, oh, yay, they translated The Hobbit. But no, these men were captives. It's true that the Red Cross did visit them, that they did get care packages from home and were able to communicate. But it's not like this was a picnic in which they were just translating The Hobbit for fun.
Absolutely. There's something about that experience. It's so harrowing. It has interested me. I remember back when I was at the Times of Israel, I did a piece about some of the Yom Kippur hostages who were held in Syria. And, the NGO sort of that they founded for former Israeli POWs is called in Hebrew Erim Balayla, awake at night. And I remember I talked to this guy who had been a pilot who was shot down over Syria during the war. And he was an incredible guy, like super high functioning, had a family, everything in his life seemed in order. And he said to me also, there's a reason why it's called that name, because that's the reality. You just cannot emerge unscathed from that experience. In fact, there's even Israeli legislation that was meant to have gone through. I'm not sure that it did. That was meant to immediately recognize PTSD in anybody who's been a POW. And I saw it throughout with these guys. Each of them had a different life. Each of them came back to a different circumstance. 5 decades have passed, and still you never shake it. So it was this thing that throughout this war accompanied me, this knowledge that even though you can rebuild your life and you can get joy out of your life, you shall never be free of the POW experience.
Right. And obviously, it doesn't only affect the men themselves, but obviously it affects their families. And I was really gratified that you included Esther Eni, who is the wife of Menachem Eni, one of the pilots who was shot down and taken prisoner, because, well, number one, he doesn't want to speak himself, but also because she gave just a completely different angle to this whole saga.
I loved talking to Esther Eni, so I was so glad that you liked it. I found her incredible. Yeah, it's true. At first, it was born of the fact that simply Menachem didn't want to speak. But then you're right. Her perspective was irreplaceable. It was fantastic. It gave the other side. So while we're following what's happening with them in prison, from the solitary confinement and the torture to the coming together as a group, the decisions that they took as a group, which are really probably in some ways more remarkable even than the translation itself. On the other side, there's a family and there's a wife, and she's dealing with all these things. And I found her to be just an incredible woman.
And it's so lovely how she portrays her husband with such swagger. I mean, that's the only word you could use, right?
She's incredible. I had to take out, as a journalist and an editor, there's stuff, I admit, even though I hope you didn't scare everybody away by how long it is. But yeah, it's plenty long. And so I had to take out her backstory. But her backstory is mind-blowing. She herself, having lived through the Holocaust and escaped from Kiev and Operation Barbarossa, and she had her child taken. She, as a child, was taken from her mother during the war, and her mother abducted her with the help of a mailman. Incredible stuff. So she was a fantastic character, yeah.
There were no lack of characters, as you said. And one of the ones that I really enjoyed learning about was Moti Babler, because unlike these pilots, he was, as you said, he was just trekking along with another guy called Moti trying to sell some Coca-Cola and cigarettes, essentially. And we hear the whole capture story, which is amazing. And also, as you said, he, more than any of the other ones, really was open about how much this affected him and his life after they were free. Such an important piece of the equation here. But I want to ask you, Mitch, how did you even learn about this story to begin with, about the Hobbit translation?
Okay. Can I say one word about Moti? Just it's interesting, his voice is the one that lingers in my mind. When I think of it, I just hear him telling it. He was also, it's such a privilege to meet these people and speak with him. He's incredible, I saw the Hebrew as a translator. I've thought about it a lot. There are 3 translations today of The Hobbit. These guys, actually, I don't even say this in the piece, but when they get home with The Hobbit in translation on these little thin blue Egyptian issue notebooks, it turns out that Morabitan, the biggest Israeli publisher, has already released a translation of The Hobbit. But Rami, one of the characters, meets with the head of the publishing house and convinces him to release theirs as well. And he says, on condition that I'm able to write translated by the pilots, the pilot's translation. And so he does. And I remember seeing that. It's one of the central translations of The Hobbit in Hebrew. And I remember thinking, God, how did that happen? How did they get to translate The Hobbit? And what an incredible experience that must have been as sort of a way to escape an awful reality. And how did it work, nuts and bolts wise, also as a translator? And so I loved learning about all of those components while reporting the story.
So reporting the story is exactly the right word, because it's not a podcast like what I do, just blah, blah, blah. And then the other person on the other side says blah, blah, blah. No, this is a story that you reported out over, years, correct? When did you start working on this episode?
Well, first of all, I don't think you do blah, blah, blah. And there was a long time where it was dormant because once the war broke out, it was dormant for a while. But I spent months and they're also, I think this happens a lot. They're a bit of a closed society. Like they know each other. Not everybody loves each other and they don't always love to be in touch with one another. But once I spoke to Esther, then I got the number of somebody else and Jeff, once I found him in America, he lives in Colorado, and so I was able to be in touch with more of those who are still alive, and so yeah, it took a few months, I would say, of reporting, the initial reporting.
And what's amazing as well about the quality of the production of you guys over at Israel Story is just the sound effects and the soundtrack. Every note, every has a meaning in this piece, and I'm just in awe of the craftsmanship of it. That alone must have taken, I don't know. Actually, I don't know. A long time. Yeah.
That took weeks. And that was the work of Zev Levi. He did the sound design mostly. And yeah, it takes a long time.
Okay, so with no further ado, please enjoy this work of art. Get yourself a good cup of coffee or maybe a carafe because it is rather long. And of course, it can be imbibed in pieces as well. So enjoy this episode of Israel Story, The Hebrew Hobbit.
Thanks, Amanda.
Thanks, Mitch.
Hey, I'm Ishi Harman, and this is Israel Story. Israel Story is brought to you by the Jerusalem Foundation and the Times of Israel. Next week, we'll be celebrating the second Passover since the start of the war. People around the world will gather at Seder tables and talk about slavery and freedom, liberty and social justice. We'll ask how this night, this Seder, is different from all other nights. We'll offer up some answers about bitter herbs and comfortable cushions. But the truth is that once again, just like the previous 554 nights, there will be countless people throughout the region who aren't reclined and sheltered, but are rather suffering and homeless and feeling pain. There will be countless Seder tables with empty seats and missing people. I'm recording this in late March and pray in every possible way that by the time it airs, it will no longer be true. But at least as of today, there will also be Israeli hostages who are still held in captivity in Gaza. People for whom the words of the Haggadah are, more than anything else, an accurate description of their daily lives. People who will say this is the bread of affliction that our ancestors ate in the land of Egypt, and know, in their growling stomachs, exactly what that means. And people who will whisper, with the most deep-seated hope, this year we are here. Next year, let us be in the land of Israel. This year we are slaves. Next year, let us be free. And at the same time, in homes scattered throughout the country and the world, there will also be 30 Israelis and 5 citizens of Thailand who did gain their freedom since the last Seder. People who, a year ago, were prisoners of the Hamas, and this year can, thankfully, celebrate the Seder at home with their families, or at least with what's left of their families. Long before the war began, long before we could imagine what was just around the corner, we started working on a Passover episode that told the story of a small group of Israelis who, more than half a century ago, experienced their own exodus from Egypt, their own journey from captivity to freedom. We sat on this piece for a long time, since with all that's transpired since October 7th, it accrued painful layers of meaning we could have never anticipated. And today, with both sadness and hope, we share it with you. Our producer, Mitch Ginsburg, will take it from here.
השעה 11:10. מטוס הצלב האדום מביא
It's November 16th, 1973, and we're at the military section of the Lod airport. Among many generals and dignitaries milling around the tarmac are Prime Minister Golda Meir and Defense Minister Moshe Dayan. It is, after all, a celebratory day, the first bit of good news since the end of the Yom Kippur War 3 weeks earlier. But there's also a palpable sense of anxiety in the air. Dayan, whose hands are stuffed deep in his pockets, is pacing back and forth. Dado, the commander of the army, is chain-smoking. And Golda, in a dark navy dress and single strand of pearls, is cupping her face in her right palm. They all look tense, but there's something particularly anguished in Golda's gaze. As if she's the only one who knows, the only one who fully realizes that the momentary joy will soon be streaked with sorrow.
נמל התעופה בלוד שיודע פגישות נרגשות לא ידע התרגשות כזאת. וכל המילים
Soon, a red and white DC-6 passenger plane lands, and out of it comes a stream of young men. They walk down the stairs in striped pajamas, wide eyes, and matted hair. Some of them look dazed, lost. These are the fresh POWs, the ones who were captured during the Yom Kippur War the previous month. But then alongside them is another group, well-groomed, well-dressed.
Yeah, we had white shirts and pants, and the fashion of the day, our hair was pretty long.
The guys in this group most definitely do not look disheveled. One of them is carefully carrying an architectural model made out of matches. Another has his arm around General Ezer Weizmann, the former commander of the Air Force. And a third, sporting stylish sideburns, is clutching a bouquet of flowers in his left hand. Together, they look more like they're on their way to a wedding than returning from a 40-month-long stint of captivity.
It was important for us to present a picture that not only gave us satisfaction, but that would show others that you could go through this kind of a ordeal and stay okay. Come out of it the other side.
That's Yitzchak, or Jeff, Peer, one of those dashing POWs.
I saw him coming in.
And that's Esther Eini, the wife of Menachem Eini, another one of the returning soldiers.
He looked to me like a movie star.
Menachem and Jeff were two of the 10 men known collectively as Shvuyei Milchemet HaAtasha, or the POWs of the War of Attrition. They were a motley crew, really. 6 airmen, 2 infantry soldiers, and 2 canteen workers. They had been captured in separate incidents, but all of them had been held, most of the time together, in an Egyptian prison for more than 3.5 years.
וכל המילים עניות מלתאר את שהתרחש כאן יום חזרת שבויינו.
Their return was emotional, both for the country as a whole, and of course, for the men themselves. Some of them felt at home as soon as they stepped into their wives' open arms.
He was smiling, he was happy. And then he saw me, and we ran one to the other. The children after me, we hugged, and then he looked at the children, he took them on his hand.
For others, the exhilaration would soon be overshadowed by devastating news.
We went through very difficult times together, and it's not something that I need or want to dwell on. And I think seeing and talking with people, there's always the possibility of delving into things that I don't really want to bring up at this point.
But we'll get to all that in good time. For now, I want to draw your attention to a small, tattered bag Menachem Eini is holding.
Very cheap looking and terrible. So opposite to his love of fine things. You must understand, Menachem is a feinschmecker. So to come back with a schmate, it was funny to look.
Funny, perhaps, but that brown knapsack actually held a treasure. A manuscript that would make these men and their unlikely story momentarily famous. A Hebrew translation of The Hobbit. It was the fruit of their communal work during the years in which they were held in one of Egypt's most notorious dungeons. And as a translator myself, it's the reason I've always been drawn to their story. I view their achievement in a golden light. Salvation through translation. Ever since I first learned of this saga, I've thought a lot about JRR Tolkien's fantasy world and the reprieve it must have granted these men as they waited out the endless hours and days in the depths of Cairo's Abbasiyya prison. Tolkien himself, like our captives in Egypt, was plucked from his Oxfordshire and dropped into the theater of war. World War I, that is. For them, it was the sand dunes of the Sinai. For him, more than half a century earlier, it was the mud, blood, and mustard gas of the French trenches. For both, home was beyond reach, and the sacrifice must have felt infinite.
Stories, practically always are human stories, practically always about one thing, aren't they? Death.
And when it was finally time to be released, the return, for both our men and for Tolkien, was laden with the irony of real life. That's the raw material from which the Hobbit was forged.
Across the bridge, the elves thrust their prisoners, but Bilbo hesitated in the rear. He did not at all like the look of the cavern mouth, and he only made up his mind not to desert his friends just in time to scuttle over at the heels of the last elves before the great gates of the king closed behind them with a clang.
And that's what makes these two tales, that of the Hobbit and that of its unusual translation, somewhat alike. Both are tales of adventure and terror, bravery and betrayal, and above all else, the things that ordinary men are sometimes called to do.
I am looking for someone to share in an adventure that I am arranging, and it's very difficult to find anyone. I should think so, in these parts. We are plain, quiet folk, and have no use for adventurers. Nasty, disturbing, uncomfortable things make you late for dinner. I can't think what anybody sees in them.
In the 1967 Six-Day War, the IDF conquered the Sinai Peninsula, a vast tract of desert which was almost 3 times the size of the entire state of Israel. For most Israelis, the period following the dramatic victory was a euphoric and peaceful time. But while the city dwellers in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv were going to discos and schmoozing at cafes, the IDF was engaged in an exhausting war of attrition along its southern border. As the poet Chaim Guri succinctly put it, Tel Aviv is a light, while across the canal they fight. And indeed, Israeli military outposts were soon created in the Sinai, and thousands of soldiers were deployed to man and protect them. There was for years a seemingly never-ending series of clashes, skirmishes, and bombardments, leading to some 400 casualties on the Israeli side and thousands on the Egyptian side. Of the 10 Israeli prisoners of war held in Egypt, the first to fall into captivity was Captain Dan Avidan. This was on December 14th, 1969, as the War of Attrition, which didn't yet have a name, had just begun. Avidan, a 37-year-old reservist and father of 3, was on his way back to his outpost along the Suez Canal when his jeep was ambushed by Egyptian commandos. 2 of the soldiers that were with him were killed on the spot. Dan was severely injured. His legs were shattered by bullets, and when the enemy reached him, he simply raised his arms and surrendered his weapon. 7 weeks later, on February 9th, 1970, a newly married Mirage pilot by the name of Avinoam Kaldes was locked in a dogfight high up in the skies above Sinai. He managed to shoot down 2 enemy MiGs, but the second one exploded right beside him, and Avinoam was forced to bail over Egyptian soil. On the ground, he was picked up by 2 armed farmers and taken to the Mukhtar, or leader, of the village. For a short while, he managed to pretend to be a Russian pilot, But when an Israeli Air Force chopper approached for an attempted rescue, the charade was up. Avinoam was handed off to the police and was swiftly and brutally imprisoned. 2 days after that, it was Moti Babler's turn. A love-struck 24-year-old, he had found himself in the Sinai almost by chance. All he wanted, really, was to start a family.
בא אליי חבר, ואמר לי, תקשיב, מוטי, אני יודע שאתה רוצה ללכת להתחתן, אתה ויפה.
A friend of mine came to me and said, listen, Moti, I know you want to get married, you and Yafa. So come work with us in Sinai. You'll get 1,000 liras a month, and you won't spend a dime there because you won't be in the city.
אתה לא בעיר.
You'll save up, and within a year, tops, you'll be able to buy an apartment and get married.
תקנו דירה, תתחתנו.
Moti's job was to be a shikimist, driving a mobile canteen between the IDF outposts, selling soldiers little tastes of home. Bamba, Tempo Cola, Sano soap.
סבבה, עבדתי, באמת אהבתי.
So sababa, I went down there and worked, and I actually really liked the job. I'd pull up at the army's outposts, and the soldiers were always so thrilled to see me. Let's put it this way.
שאם היה מופיע אותו רגע אלוהים, היה פחות מעניין אותה מהקנטינה שמגיעה.
If at that very moment God himself would have shown up, the soldiers would have been less interested in him than in my canteen.
Moti's comparison of his work to the divine notwithstanding, in the hierarchy of army roles, being a shikimist carries very little glory. They are not combat soldiers, and basically stand at the bottom of the military pecking order. But on that fateful February day in 1970, Moti and his fellow canteen man, also named Moti by the way, decided on the spur of the moment to ignore their commanding officer's directive. Instead of taking a circuitous inland route, they opted for the shortcut to an outpost known as Zahava alongside the Suez Canal. The week had been heavy with bombardments, and the route was considered dangerous. But the two Motis wanted to make it to their destination on time. They drove the truck down the dusty desert road, taking in the tranquil waters of the canal and humming along with the tunes on the radio. Between them, they had a single rifle, which, incidentally, was tucked away and out of reach.
ואז הדלקתי סיגריה בדיוק.
And I remember that I lit myself a cigarette, leaned back, and just then, suddenly, a rocket hit the road right in front of our truck, and the whole road sort of blew up in our faces.
Surprisingly, Moti wasn't overly perturbed. He instructed the other Moti, who was on his first day on the job, to jump. The two bailed out of the moving canteen, tumbling in the soft sand. Once they looked up, Moti realized two things: that the other Moti had been shot in the shoulder, and that
there was a live grenade right next to us. I looked at it, and the first thought I had was, whoa, a grenade. I better pick it up and throw it as far as possible. Things came into focus, seemed crystal clear, and every second felt like an hour in my mind.
Just as Moti realized what was going on, he saw a group of Egyptian soldiers running their way, their bayonets pointed straight at him. He considered pulling the safety pin out of the grenade and letting the chips fall where they may, but an Egyptian commando was quicker to the punch. He kicked the grenade out of reach and pummeled Moti. Soon enough, the two Shekimistim found themselves being marched down the sloping sand to the water's edge.
We reached the Suez Canal, and the truth is that I still didn't grasp I was being taken into captivity.
The Egyptian soldiers threw them into rubber rafts and began heading to the other bank. Once they made it to the Egyptian side,
my eyes went black. There were like 30 or 40 Egyptian villagers, just regular farmers from the area, who began running towards us. They were all yelling, Allah is great, Allah is great, and holding pitchforks and hoes. So I said to myself, here we go, there's going to be a lynch here, I'm going to die, that's it. When the first one of them got close enough, he tried to bring down his shovel on my head, but I somehow managed to move my head enough so he hit my arm instead. And just then, I heard a shot ring out. The officer of the Egyptian soldiers who had kidnapped us had shot the farmer in the leg, and all the other ones started running away in the other direction. A military truck showed up, they loaded us on the truck, and we drove off.
They didn't know it, of course, but the two motis were also on their way to Cairo's infamous Abbasiyah prison. As the frequency of these incidents along the canal increased, a more high-stakes battle, at least strategically, was taking place way up in the sky. And if the Shechem was at the bottom of the military pyramid, at the very top stood the idea of fighter pilot.
I don't know how to describe it. It's a sense of freedom, a sense of being one with a machine. I always was able to fly airplanes naturally. I didn't have to think about what I'm doing. And that's what I always loved about flying.
Throughout the war of attrition, fighter pilots like American-born Jeff Peer were busy conducting recurring missions into enemy territory. In late June 1970, 4.5 months after the two motis were ambushed and abducted, Jeff was on the runway of the Chatzor Air Base in the front seat of an F-4 Phantom aircraft. He was awaiting his turn to take off and participate in a wave of strikes against Egypt's new air defense batteries, supplied to them by the Soviets.
And since the Egyptian Air Force knew that they didn't stand a chance against the Israeli Air Force, they invested heavily in developing their anti-aircraft capacity, so very quickly it became a showdown between our Air Force and their anti-aircraft missiles.
That's pilot Rami Harpaz, another hero of our story. Rami passed away in 2019, so I'll be using recordings of him recounting his story to an audience of high schoolers shortly before he died. Anyway, Rami and Jeff were both part of the same mission that day. Rami took off in the first wave. Jeff was scheduled to be in the second.
We were a formation of 6 Phantom planes heading southwest in a 220 direction. We were flying at low altitude and there was a complete electronic silence. No radio, no radar, nothing, so they won't be able to detect us. We were flying low over the sea, nearly skimming the waves. We crossed the beaches of Sinai over the Bardawil, hit the Suez Canal, and continued on to the Kotomia airfield, where the Egyptians had just installed 3 new missile batteries.
As they neared their mark, Rami pulled up, rose to 20,000 feet, and dropped into a dive.
You point the nose of the plane toward the target, set your sight on the target, and then you have exactly 6 seconds to stabilize and pull the trigger, letting the bomb loose. Once that's done, you pull away, and then you look down to see the target blazing. Then, you're flying over the horizon, and you're on your way home.
But 60 seconds into Rami's retreat, his backseater reported,
Neulim alenu. They locked on us. I looked at the radar and saw incoming missiles heading our way.
Rami took a deep breath, waited patiently until the missile was close, and then, at the very last second, jammed the stick with all his might, causing the plane to dive violently.
But the problem is, they knew this trick too.
So as soon as he came out of the maneuver,
boom. And whoever wants to know what it feels like, just imagine you're in a train going 100 kilometers an hour crashing into a concrete wall. That's more or less what it feels like.
the missile tore off the Phantom's tail.
And if you ever made a paper airplane during a boring class at school, you know that a plane without a tail does not fly. And well, a metal plane without a tail does not fly either.
Rami and his backseat weapons system officer ejected at 14,000 feet. Floating down to the ground, he spoke into his radio. "I'm sorry," he said. "We were hit and had to bail. I'll try to hide in the hills to the northeast till you come rescue me." Listening in to that ominous message was Jeff in his own cockpit, waiting for takeoff on the runway.
So I said to my backseater, well, this is going to be an interesting flight.
Despite the news of Rami's plane having just been hit, they took off. And sure enough, within minutes,
we saw 2 missiles coming at us. I tried to maneuver the airplane, and both missiles exploded near the airplane. The airplane was damaged, but I managed to release my bombs on the target that I was assigned. And now I'm trying to get back east of the Suez Canal with a damaged airplane. I'm flying at about 11,000 feet, as fast as I can. One engine's on fire, and the other engine is making bad sounds. At that time, my wingman, who had observed all of this, and he was flying below us, noticed another missile coming at us. And the missile exploded apparently right next to the airplane and severed the tail section. Amazingly, the communication within the airplane still worked. I still could talk to my backseater, and I told him to prepare to eject and initiated the ejection sequence. The F-4 has 2 separate canopies, so the backseater's canopy left the airplane, and I saw in the mirror and felt his ejection seat go, and supposedly 3/4 of a second after that, my seat is supposed to fire automatically and to eject me from the front seat.
That didn't happen.
And I remember in training that they said that 3/4 of a second can seem like a lifetime. And I remember thinking to myself that if I can think these thoughts, it's much more than 3/4 of a second.
Jeff came tumbling through the cloud cover, still strapped to a plummeting, flaming airplane.
So it turned out that my seat was damaged by the explosion of the missiles, and it did not function. So making an interesting story shorter, I was able to manually just open the canopy and jump out the side of the airplane, which was spinning in the air, and found myself very, very low.
Somehow, he managed to open the parachute.
I was in the air for about a second under the parachute before I hit the ground, and found myself as a visitor in Egypt.
Jeff knew he was in dire straits.
They had seen the airplane fall, and very quickly I noticed a truck full of Egyptian army people driving over the sand dunes in my direction. And the somewhat, in retrospect, humorous side of this was I started to run. They saw me, and they came to about 100 or 200 meters from me, and all the soldiers got out and started shooting at me. And I remember thinking to myself that I'm a pretty good shot with a rifle. I was at the time, and I can't hit a moving target at 200 meters, so I just kept running. And I heard the bullets and all that, and like in the Western movies. And they got back on their truck and drove again, but again stopped a couple hundred meters from me and started shooting again. And I kept running. And finally they figured out that this is not going to work for them, and they kept driving. So as I saw them closing in on me, I had an emergency radio that pilots have to facilitate being rescued. And I said, I can't defeat the whole Egyptian army by myself, so I'm going to have to surrender. And I thought I was going to be killed. So I put the radio on the ground and tried to destroy it with whatever means I had, and raised my hands and was taken as a POW. Not in a very nice way.
As had happened in Moti's case, only the intervention of the commanding Egyptian officer saved Jeff from being lynched.
Which I had fully expected to happen. Now, I can say that in a sort of easygoing way right now, but obviously I was pretty scared.
Jeff, too, was taken into captivity in Cairo. 2.5 weeks later, on Friday, July 17th, 1970, Menachem Eini, a fellow Air Force officer, invited his friend, colleague, and commander, Shmuel Chetz, over for Shabbat dinner. Esther Eini, Menachem's wife, recalls a tense atmosphere that evening. She also remembers the way Menachem, rather atypically, insisted on bathing their 2 daughters and brushing their hair at length before dinner. But that's not all she remembers.
He somehow felt it is the last night. And he really wanted very much to leave me with the best feeling a woman can, how would I say, he did everything in his imagination that can make me happy at that night. And it was so. All the time I was with this last unbelievable night of love.
They only fell asleep with first light. But when Esther woke up several hours later, Menachem was no longer by her side. He'd been called up to fly on a mission. This was in no way out of the ordinary. For more than a year, Menachem, Chetz, and the other pilots had been flying nearly daily combat sorties, working, as he once remarked, like slaves. But as this grueling routine had become the norm, Esther spent a lazy Saturday with a friend, another pilot's wife, at the beach. At noon, they saw a formation of Phantom F-4s scream by carrying a heavy load. She looked up and whispered a silent prayer.
We came back quite late from the sea. No call. I was cleaning the children. I was washing the bathing suit. 5 o'clock. He didn't call. I became worried. And then a knock on my door.
It was the commander of the base.
He was white and shaking. I looked at him and I knew something happened. I didn't know what happened, but I was afraid and my heart closed.
The commander looked at Esther and said,
Menachem and Chetz, his partner, their airplane was shut down. Chetz was killed. Menachem is alive, very wounded, but he is alive.
The Air Force knew this to be true because Eini had spent his last moments as a free man radioing another pilot who participated in the same mission and hadn't been hit. "I'm surrounded," he said, as the Egyptian soldiers closed in on him. "See you soon, and send regards at home." Esther stood at the door, staring at the bearer of this horrible news. Her 2 daughters both leapt from the bath and ran to the door, still wrapped in their towels.
What's happening?
But Esther, who was born as Fira Kharkovskaya in the middle of World War II and had survived the war stashed away in an Uzbeki village and then in a Polish orphanage, kept her cool.
And then I knew how I will react and explain to them. This will be the main behavior of their life. So I didn't cry. I knelt on my knees. I looked at their eyes and I said, very calm, the plane of Abba was shut down. Abba is a prisoner of war. We will not see him for a long time, but we will continue with our life. Nothing is changed in your life. Everything will be for us the same, except that we will not see our father.
Menachem, who was born in Iraq, is 87 now. And even though more than 50 years have passed since his return from captivity, he still refuses to talk about his time in Egypt. In fact, not once since his return in 1973 has he sat down with his wife, his own wife, and shared tales of that period. And perhaps that helps explain Esther's own urge to explore the details of her husband's incarceration. When I arrived at their gorgeous home in the village of Karmei Yosef, she told me that she feels that her ability to talk about the ordeal is also somehow helpful to him.
I must show you.
She took me down to the basement, where, in a reddish trunk, she keeps all the material related to Menachem's Shevi, or captivity.
This is everything that is connected with the Shevi. All these are letters.
Those are his letters from
Menachem.
From the prison?
From the prison. Let me see a moment. These are all the prisoners.
That's the day they came home, right?
These are the women.
Oh, I need to see that in the light. Where are you?
This.
Beautiful.
Yeah,
oh
I was also feinschmecker.
It's a bit of a cowboy outfit you have on there.
Yeah, it was in the desert, so I had to. Oh, look at this one. I want you to see this. I discovered I was going to die. Since the first day, he wrote a diary.
Estelle took out a yellowing piece of paper. On it, in shaky handwriting, was written the date, July 18th, 1970. And under it, only one word.
Atchala, the beginning.
The next page also contained just a single word, as did the next, and the next, and the next. During those early weeks, all he was capable of doing was inking out one word per day, and all of them were written with his left hand, as his right, dominant hand had been badly injured. As it turned out, the fact that Menachem had been severely wounded was oddly fortuitous. He was held alone in a hospital ward for 12 long months, and though he was interrogated at length, the questioning was largely without violence, given his condition. Dan Avidan, Avinoam Kaldes, the two Motis, Rami, Jeff, and the others weren't as lucky.
The questioning started. Who are you? What are you? And I pretended I was some sort of Rambo.
Moti, the canteen driver, again.
I just told the interrogators my name. And that's it. I said, I have nothing else to tell you. That's the truth. I just sell candies. And they said, okay, fine, we'll see. And then 2 soldiers came into the room with a metal rod. My hands and feet were shackled, and they slid the rod in between my arms and my feet, and they hung me upside down like a cluster of grapes.
When I asked Jeff about the first months of his captivity, he refused to go into it. All he would say was,
there were times during the first period of being a POW where I would have preferred to be dead.
The men, everyone that is except for Menachem, were kept in solitary confinement in dark 2 by 3 meter cells, handcuffed almost all the time, deprived of food and water, and beaten repeatedly.
One of the crew members that was captured was in a cell not far from mine. It was a very young backseater who went through some very hard physical times and was ultimately killed during his interrogation period in Egypt.
That man was Lieutenant Moshe Goldwasser, a fellow Air Force navigator whose plane was shot down in August 1970. And what Jeff is delicately saying is that he remembers hearing him being tortured to death. With time, however, the harsh treatment subsided. By early 1971, the Israeli prisoners were freed from their solitary confinement and brought together in a relatively large cell with an outside courtyard.
It was one of the happiest moments I could imagine. My blindfold being removed and finding myself in a room with 7 other people at the same time, others who were brought there after me. So it was a feeling of great relief I certainly felt that I now had a chance of getting out of this alive.
We'll be right back. And we're back. So we're in the middle of the story of Shvuyei Milchemet HaAtasha, the POWs of the War of Attrition, 10 Israeli soldiers who were captured by Egyptian forces in a series of separate incidents in 1969 and 1970. Just before the break, we heard how, after a long period of harsh investigations, torture, and solitary confinement, the Israeli soldiers were placed, together, in a cell in Cairo's Abbasiyah prison. Mitch Ginsburg will pick it up from there.
Though they now all shared a cell and, seemingly, a common fate, the men had come from notably different backgrounds. Among them were kibbutznikim and city folk, tzabarim born in Israel, and olim from Iraq, Argentina, and the United States, Ashkenazim and Mizrachim. Some had served together for years and knew each other well, while others were complete strangers. They were all IDF soldiers, of course, but having all emerged from independent interrogations, they didn't know who had said what, and just how open and honest they could be with each other. Over the last 2 years, I've spoken to almost all of those who are still alive, and to family members of those who have passed away. And though the physical conditions of the cell at Abbasiyah prison represented a marked improvement over solitary confinement, every single one of them described a gnawing, ever-present, and unbearable angst. There was no end in sight, and they assumed that their limitless and bleak horizon would be broken only by another war, or, and this seemed much less likely in the early 70s, a peace agreement. And yet, despite the overarching despair, they quickly made a decision that would alter their entire experience of captivity. They wouldn't just keep calm, carry on, and ride out the daily grind. Instead, they would thrive. But how?
All of us very quickly decided that a military structure within our environment was not the best way to keep everybody happy.
Pilot Rami Harpaz, a major at the time, was the ranking officer in the group. Perhaps it was his kibbutz upbringing, or maybe his exceptionally high EQ. But Rami realized that imposing a military hierarchy would be ill-suited for their situation. Instead, and in stark contrast to what was practiced, say, at the Hanoi Hilton, where soldiers like John McCain used a tap code system to pass orders along the chain of command, he helped establish a different, more communal model.
So it was very much kibbutz.
Every Friday night, they would light a single Shabbat candle and gather around for a weekly meeting. At first, the candle was an improvised cotton wick stuck into a hole they punched in an oily sardine can. With time, once they began receiving visits from the Red Cross, they got real candles and an array of other supplies. But no matter what type of candles they lit, the weekly meetings were what was truly holy. For 139 Friday nights in a row, they met and voted on the issues of the day.
How should we celebrate the holidays? What should we ask for from the Red Cross?
That, again, is Rami Harpaz.
What should our daily routine be? Who should be in charge of what? What should we name the cats? All sorts of things we could decide.
Gradually, their conditions improved. They received prepackaged food and money to spend at the prison canteen, a record player, and books, even a ping-pong table. Soon the lights within the cell were left to their discretion, and they were allowed to take care of a couple of stray cats in the courtyard. The decisions were all made collectively. One man, one vote. They decided to try their hand at group therapy, formed a chess league, and read literature aloud once a week. But while all this quasi-communist camaraderie was going on, Menachem, Esther's husband, was still hospitalized, disconnected from his fellow POWs.
Shalom to my cute wife.
This is Esther, reading from Menachem's first letter home, dated September 23rd, 1970, 2 months into his captivity. Though he was still writing with his left hand, the penmanship is already clearer and steadier.
Last week I got your first 2 letters, and of course I was very happy, but also disappointed. Happy because these were your letters from our home. Disappointed because the letters were old. I hope with time to receive the letters in chronological order. Today I got a letter from 29/8, which gives the impression that you are being restricted in the number of words you are allowed to write. Otherwise, why the emphatic brevity?
He went on to give her instructions about care packages and the way they should be sent. No perishables, he wrote, and
if almonds, then in a box and not a plastic bag. And my greatest request from you is books. Send many and only very good ones. English is fine too. I want Chayei Adam by Shalom Aleichem and other fine books of your choosing.
He then signed it, as he would all his subsequent letters,
Abba. He is always signing Abba. He is Abba of the children, he is Abba of me.
And to a large extent, he brought that paternalistic attitude with him to Abbasiyah prison, when he was finally released from the hospital and united with the other Israeli POWs. And though everyone was obviously delighted to see him alive, his arrival upset the gentle balance of power the prison commune had created. The minutes of the July 16, 1971 meeting give a sense of this turmoil.
Meeting number 21. Menachem arrived yesterday from the hospital after a year there. Our newest member is a master of wonderful ideas, who during his convalescence has had all the time in the world to think. So he is the originator of all the proposals tonight. The others must be burnt out already. Here he comes.
The "here he comes" was written in English and adorned with an exclamation mark. And the "has had all the time in the world to think" seems, at least to me, like a reminder to Menachem that, unlike him, they did not spend the last year in a pristine hospital room with white sheets, relatively good medical care, and a large window. I might be reading too much into it, but Menachem himself attested that he was, quote, like a spoon that stirs the tea. And that spoon clanged against the cup, often. The cup being, more than anyone else, the only other person in the cell with his same rank, Rami Harpaz.
There was on one side Rami. Everyone is the same. Everyone has the same right to decide. On the other hand was Menachem. He said, but some of us have better decisions than others. So how will we be sure that the best decision is taken and not because the popularity of some one of us? Because Menachem was very not popular in the group.
But this clash of cultures and personalities didn't stop Menachem from hitting the ground running. He had no patience for the prevailing egalitarian atmosphere and wanted to run the show his way. From now on, he said, he wanted days to have a clear structure and schedule, and time to be well spent.
Menachem changed a lot of things in the room. He demanded that we make a proper table for the room, so we did. He demanded that we organize meals, classes, exercise sessions, and we obeyed. All of that can be chalked up in his favor. It all came from him, and I'm grateful for that. I really am. But I have to say, to my great regret, that when it comes to interpersonal relations, to just regular human skills, he's got nothing. Really close to zero.
But Menachem was seemingly unfazed by his apparent lack of popularity. He was way more interested in simply getting things done. Within a few days, he had devised a mandatory study schedule for the group. Menachem himself, a Technion graduate with a degree in aeronautics, would teach a daily course in advanced math and physics. Rami would teach trigonometry and mechanics. Another prisoner, the Mirage pilot, Avinoam Caldes, would teach Bible. And Jeff would teach 2 levels of English classes, advanced and more advanced. The initial resistance to this scholastic regimen soon dissipated, and ultimately an equilibrium was reached between Menachem's top-down leadership style and Rami's kumbaya-like communal one. And between these two shepherds, the flock kept itself busy, very busy. They sewed dresses for their daughters back home, they carved little statues out of soap bars, and they designed and built a folding table that could both seat all 10 of them and be easily stored away when not in use. Before they knew it, they got into a groove of impressive productivity. For Moti Babler, the Shekemist, this productivity went in an unlikely direction.
My friend Jeff, or Yitzchak, Peer, the pilot, had a brother who lived in America, and that brother used to send him Playboy magazines.
And Moti, it seems, was drawn to the arts and design section. Yes, apparently that's a thing. Anyway, one day he told me,
I saw a picture of a really unusual house in one of the Playboys. It was a German house, and I decided I just had to build a replica or a model of that house.
Not having much to work with, he fashioned himself into something of a match maverick. Rami, the trigonometry teacher, took care of calculating the scale. The Red Cross helped procure glue, and everyone else bartered with the prison guards for matches. Several months later, Moti had completed a perfect replica of the humble Playboy abode. He then moved on to an even more ambitious project, a miniature Eiffel Tower. But the most lasting legacy of these captives' incredible ingenuity didn't come from porn magazines. It came from books.
In one of the first few boxes of books that we received, that we're able to get, were all 3 books of The Lord of the Rings. And I devoured them. Tolkien's trilogy was a perfect book to send to a POW. Very well-defined good and evil, hardships, and it was a great escape from the physical environment that we were in.
Jeff, who had received the books in a package sent by his brother, decided that he'd share some of this much-cherished escapism with his fellow soldiers during his daily English classes. It's a bit stereotypical, but most of the Air Force captives were avid readers. All told, by the time they left their cell, they had amassed a library of some 3,000 books. But none had a grip on the group like Tolkien's tales. They were passed around among those who could read the books in their original English, and then discussed and dissected at length.
The others in the room who were not able to read those books as fluently as we were and to get the understanding and the enjoyment that we got out of them, asked us about these stories. And we started to tell them a little bit in our Friday night meetings. We had story time or something of that nature where we would tell a part of the book.
The first book of the Lord of the Ring trilogy often mentions the prelude to the series, The Hobbit, which the group did not have. Jeff, via the Red Cross, asked his brother to send it to them, and the entire group waited in great anticipation.
Finally, The Hobbit arrived.
In a hole in the ground, there lived a hobbit. Not a nasty, dirty, wet hole, filled with the ends of worms and an oozy smell, nor yet a dry, bare, sandy hole with nothing in it to sit down on or to eat. It was a hobbit hole, and that means comfort.
I read it first and then gave it to the others to read, and there were so many questions by the group about The Hobbit that we decided that it would only be fair if we translated it so everybody could enjoy this book.
Translating can be solitary and grueling work. The initial process of transferring the text from one language to another, before the joy of trying to make it sing, often feels to me like field labor, repetitive and dull. the rows so long there's seemingly no end in sight. But the process the prisoners came up with, none of them, of course, had any training in the art of translation, was different. Creative and collaborative, democratic and thorough. Translating in Abbasiyah prison was more like the study of Talmud, done in pairs, much discussed, and capable of creating its own glow.
And the way it happened was that Avi and I would go outside when we were allowed into the outside area alone, camp out on the sand next to a wall somewhere, and I would read the book in English and do a simultaneous translation into Hebrew.
As Jeff read and translated The Hobbit into his colloquial Hebrew, Avi, or Avinoam Kaldes, would ask clarifying questions and jot everything down in his perfect hand. The pale blue Egyptian notebook would then be passed on to the next chavruta.
And then Rami and Menachem would take what they called Jeff's Hebrew and translate it into real Hebrew.
The next step was reading it out loud to the group.
The polishing was done by a committee. We struggled and we had arguments, and it was a great way to stay as sane as we could.
I asked Jeff to read me some of their Hebrew translation.
Ayin bepanim khulim.
He chose the part in which Bilbo Baggins, the Hobbit of the title, receives 3 riddles from a creature called Gollum. The stakes in the scene are high. Bilbo will either be set free or else be eaten by the slimy character who rules the underground lake in the Cavern of the Goblins. I don't know why Jeff chose that particular passage. Perhaps because of the elegance of the Hebrew translation. But I do know that the last of the 3 riddles Bilbo was asked was brutally relevant to a group of POWs, sitting and translating in captivity. Here's JRR Tolkien himself, asking the hardest of the riddles.
This thing all things devours, birds, beasts, trees, flowers, gnaws iron, bites steel, grinds hard stones to meal, slays king, ruins town, and beats high mountain down.
The answer, as Bilbo managed to guess, to what gnaws iron and grinds hard stones to meal, is, well, Time. The endless expanse of time, which was really the only thing the men in prison had in abundance, and it ate at them like acid.
Even a person who is in jail and knows that he is going to be in jail for 10 years, time passes and he gets closer and closer to reaching this aim of freedom. They didn't have it.
That's Professor Amia Lieblich, a psychologist who wrote a book, Seasons of Captivity, about this group of POWs. In it, she describes how the translation operation became central to their communal activities in prison and occupied them for months. But after they completed the translation, something surprising happened. The group, very much guided by Rami's sense of equality, simply decided to stop.
Because they felt that it created 2 groups.
See, the literary project inadvertently managed to upset the gentle equilibrium of the commune. Some, like Jeff, were absolutely integral to its success, while those with limited knowledge of English, Moti for example, felt left out. So once the manuscript was done, a Friday night group decision was taken not to press on to the Lord of the Rings trilogy, or to any other translation work for that matter. Instead, they went back to playing bridge and baking cakes, feeding the cats and fighting over which music to play. Time passed and their hobbit hole became increasingly cozy. At a certain point, they even got a TV. And they went on yearning for home, just like Bilbo, who is described late in the book as aching in his bones for the homeward journey. The 6th of October 1973 was Yom Kippur, and the men, none of them particularly observant, were watching Flipper the Dolphin on TV. Suddenly, an Arabic news broadcast broke in.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Menachem Eini, who lived in Baghdad till the age of 10, translated for the group. War, they were saying on TV, had broken out with Israel.
That very morning, the prison guards separated us into isolated cells. That way, if Israeli forces somehow tried to stage an operation to release us, they wouldn't find us altogether.
A few nerve-wracking days later, they were reunited, and the deputy commander of the jail himself showed up to announce that
the Egyptian army is already at the gates of Ashdod and will soon march into Tel Aviv. The whole country is about to be conquered.
While they had no way of knowing for sure, the group assumed this was nonsense. Some recall their neighbor relaying reports from the BBC.
In the studio is the Egyptian ambassador to London, Mr. Kamal Rifat. You heard what General Dayan said there, that you started the war. Ambassador, why did Egypt do this?
To the best of my knowledge, the Israelis started the war and the aggression since 1967.
Others say they heard news broadcasts in Hebrew.
דובר צה"ל מוסר כי סמוך לשעה 2 פתחו הכוחות המצריים והסוריים בהתקפה בסיני וברמת הגולן.
But what they all remember is that the next few weeks were jarring and bizarre. On the one hand, they heard the agony of the fresh Israeli POWs captured during the war being tortured down the hall. And on the other, they continued with their routine, the redesign of their bathroom, installing new ceramic tiles and a brand new sink. And while Rami, for instance, worried terribly about his wife's brother and his cousin, both of whom were pilots and both of whom, though Rami didn't know it, had indeed been killed during the war, he knew immediately, as did the rest of the group, that when the fighting was over, a prisoner swap might be in the cards. And then, one day, it happened.
They ordered us to get our things together, and that's when we understood that the end was, finally, near.
There were fierce debates about what to pack, what to leave behind, and where to hide the precious manuscript, in case it wasn't allowed out. Some insisted that the cats should also come home with them, including the one they aptly named Bilbo. They divvied up the vinyl records, decided to leave the remaining contents of their care packages for the Egyptian wardens, and boxed up the entire library. On November 16, 1973, the day they had been dreaming of for years finally arrived. The war of attrition POWs were loaded onto minibuses and taken to a nearby airfield, where they, together with some new POWs who had been captured the previous month, boarded a Red Cross plane. Some were carrying handwritten manuscripts, others handcrafted architectural models, and all were bearing deep, emotional baggage, much of which would never be unpacked.
And then I saw him coming in, and he looked to me like a movie star. He was smiling, he was happy. And then he saw me, and we ran one to the other. The children after me, we hugged, and then he looked at the children, he took them on his hand.
But this Hollywood-like ending, Esther, Menachem's wife, remembers, was short-lived.
We were standing 1 minute hugging each other with the children. Then came Rafi Arlev.
The commander of the Chatzor Air Base interrupted the family bliss and said,
Menachem, I am sorry, but father of Chetz is here. He insisted to come. Maybe there will be a miracle and his son will come also. Can you please go to him and tell him that Chetz is dead?
Standing alongside the excited families was the father of Shmulik Chetz, Menachem's front seater, who had been killed when their plane was hit 3.5 years earlier. Because the body had never been recovered, Chetz's father held out hope against all hope, and thus showed up, uninvited, to the airbase, wishing to see his son get off the plane with the rest of the prisoners. Menachem disengaged from his wife's embrace, stepped off to the side, and gave the devastated elderly man a first-hand account of his son's last moments.
And then he came back. He was so sad. We even couldn't hug anymore. He was so sad.
But within a matter of days, Menachem was seemingly, at least, back to his old self. He started flying again and was bursting with energy and a zest for life, eager to pick up both his job and his social life where they'd been left off. On the home front, however, things were different. Esther and the girls had also gone through hell during his captivity. A different hell, for sure. But for 1,217 days, they had been anxiously waiting for him to return, not knowing if it would ever happen. That entire time, Esther had taken care of the kids by herself, and they had grown up with an absent father. But now that he was finally back, she felt like he took it all for granted.
It was terrible. I was crying all the time. And then one day he said to me, you know, it's difficult for me to come every day from Tel Aviv to Chatzor. Maybe I will rent a room in Tel Aviv and I will not come every day.
For Esther, who to this day isn't sure if that meant he just wanted more space or was having an affair, this was the last straw.
When I feel terrible, I need to go to wash myself, Ambatya. I said, Rega. I went to the Ambatya and I cried. I came out of the Ambatya and I said, if you rent a room in Tel Aviv, you take all your belongings and never, never come back to this family.
Menachem, it turns out, was lucky. He came back to a partner who not only loved him, but was also strong enough to knock him back to his senses. Today, more than 51 years later, the two are still happily married. Others, however, weren't so fortunate. Jeff's wife had also shown up at the airfield to celebrate her husband's return, but unlike Esther, she was harboring a jagged secret. A week later, when they were lying in bed, she confessed to Jeff that she was in love with another man. In fact, she had wanted to tell him in real time, in a letter to the Abbasiyah prison, but the Air Force brass forbade it, fearing it would break Jeff's spirit. Jeff consented to our interview on condition that I not ask about that part of the story. And indeed I didn't. So all I can share is what he told psychologist Amia Lieblich in one of the interviews she conducted for her book about the ordeal. What hurt him most, he revealed, was that everyone on the airbase knew about the affair and had seen it unfold in real time. And that meanwhile he, during those long years of captivity, had been yearning to return to a home life that no longer existed. Right after his return, the Air Force sent Jeff and his family to a post in the United States. The idea was to put an ocean between his wife and her lover. But 1 month into their stay in America, on his first birthday as a liberated man, Jeff found a letter from the other man in their mailbox. From there, the path to divorce was short. Jeff stayed in the States, made an illustrious career as a test pilot and instructor, had 2 more children, and today lives in Colorado with his third wife. Jeff's ex-wife, who returned to Israel with their 2 daughters, and whose name I'll leave out of this story, refused my request for an interview. Rami Arpaz, who had introduced and championed the egalitarian atmosphere in the cell, returned to his military life immediately. He requested what was considered to be a cushy posting, training Skyhawk pilots deep in the Sinai Desert, a job that allowed him to spend a lot of time with his kids. He ultimately rose through the ranks and became the commander of the Ramat David Air Base. Years later, Rami and his wife Nurit co-wrote a book called The Captive and the Captive's Wife, and he spoke to countless groups of teens and soldiers about his experience. It was, he would frequently say, his way of proving to himself that his time in the torture chambers and prison cells of Abbasiyah had not been for nothing. As you might recall, Moti Babler had gone to Sinai to make some money so that he could marry his sweetheart, Yafa. He never imagined that the path to that wedding would include almost 4 years in an Egyptian prison. But to his delight, Yafa had waited for him, and the two picked up where they'd left off. In March 1974, 4 months after his return, they got married, and have since raised 3 kids and many grandkids. But Moti came back with severe PTSD, a definition that didn't even exist at the time. Looking back, he now says, he could feel it as soon as he returned, at that festive reception at the Lod airport. When a friend lifted him up on his shoulders like a returning hero, Moti begged to be put back down on the ground. But the truth is that he never fully landed. He had a hard time reintegrating into society and couldn't keep a steady job. There were periods in which he was so poor he wasn't able to put food on the table. And in many ways, the troubles never ceased.
I have all kinds of problems that follow me in life ever since my time in captivity. Gastro issues, but also mental health issues too. You want me to tell you they're all gone? They aren't. It sticks to you. It enters your soul, right here, for the rest of your life. It's just like the guys who went through the Holocaust. People always say, why do the Holocaust survivors just sit there and don't talk or anything? Well, it's things that it's a trauma that will never let go of you. Should I say that I don't dream at night about being back in captivity? I do. In the early years, I dreamed that they were coming for my kids, to take them away. And all sorts of dreams like that haunted me. What can I say? It stays with you your whole life. Nothing you can do about it.
It took decades until he was fully recognized as a wounded IDF veteran, compensated accordingly and offered treatment, which has proved to be highly effective. Throughout it all, he never stopped building elaborate structures out of matches. He's made dozens and dozens of miniature models, but, of course, the one he created in prison occupies a special place in his heart. Back in November 1973, when the POWs landed in Israel, Moti, all flustered and excited, actually forgot the model on the aircraft. But Prime Minister Golda Meir, who had boarded the plane to greet them, spotted the replica and, like a responsible mother, asked who it belonged to, making sure nobody left anything behind. Today, that match house model is on display at the Rabin Center in Tel Aviv. Moti asked that we meet there so he could show it to me.
Look, this is the famous house which I built. The German house I saw in the Playboy magazine. These are all Egyptian matches. When I built it in captivity, I also made little pieces of furniture for the inside rooms. There was a kitchen, a living room, a TV, bedrooms. There was all of that inside, really, really small. But the furniture all got ruined in all the balagan and bouncing around.
And somehow it's that description of all the miniature replicas of everything that make a home, that has stayed with me. Because when I think of the ordeal that all these men endured, I don't think of their prison cell. It's 3,000 books all stacked in neat piles, a giant folding table pressed against the wall, and the fiery Friday night votes they took on the trivial matters of daily life. Instead, I think of Moti, yearning so hard for hearth and home that his imagination was seized not by the pin-ups in the glossy Playboys, but by a quaint country house in one of its articles. And I think, of course, of the poor and brave Israeli hostages, kept somewhere nearby, and yet still beyond our reach. Like so many others here and around the world, I pray that they, like Bilbo Baggins, will find their way back home. As all things come to an end, Tolkien wrote in the final chapter of The Hobbit, a day came at last when they were in sight of the country where Bilbo had been born and bred, where the shapes of the land and of the trees were as well known to him as his hands and toes. Coming to a rise, he could see his own hill in the distance, and he stopped suddenly and said,
"Roads go ever on and on, under rock and under tree, by caves where never sun has shone, by streams that never find the sea, over snow by winter sown, and through the merry flowers of June, over grass and over stone, and under mountains in the moon. Roads go ever, ever on, under cloud and under star, yet feet that wandering have gone turn at last to home afar. Eyes that fire and sword have seen, and horror in the halls of stone, look at last on meadows green, and trees and hills they long have known.
Mitch Ginsburg. The Israel Story team includes Yochai Meital, Zev Levi, Adina Karpuch, Mitch Ginsburg, Jennifer Cutler, Hadas Kidron, Liri Carmel, Alexandra Muller, Elik Frumchenko, and Rotem Tzin. Zev Levi and Yochai Meital scored and sound designed this episode. You can catch up on all our past episodes on our site, israelstory.org, at timesofisrael.com/podcasts, or by searching for Israel Story wherever you get your podcasts. You can and should also follow us on social media under Israel Story. If you're interested in sponsoring episodes of Israel Story, email us at sponsor@israelstory.org. I'm Mishi Harman, and I wish us all a Chag Sameach v'Shaket, a happy, calm, and quiet Passover. L'shana haba'a b'Yerushalayim habunuya. And in the meantime, Shalom Shalom, and Yalla Bye.
מס הכנסה הם יקלו לי מגבר, מס ערך מוסף הם יקלו לי משדר, חברת החשמל יקלו לי מצבר, מנהל המים סתמו לי באר, ראיתי שאני מתדרדר למשבר, התחלתי הוזר, אבל עברנו את פרעה, נעבור גם את זה. טעות במחשב עלתה לי מיליון, כספומט טרף לי יתרת חשבון, מזכירה אלקטרונית דחתה לי ראיון, שופט אוטומטי שלל לי רישיון, לעורך דין מכני שלשלתי אסימון בחריץ הפה, אבל עברנו את פרעה, נעבור גם את זה. לפעמים אני חוטף את זה באוטובוס צפוף, או ביציאה ממגרשת אני דרוך ודחוף, לפעמים ברחוב מרוב חיכוך ושפשוף, מרוב ביקוש לאיזה אושר חטוף, בגב בצלעות, לפעמים בפרצוף, המרפק הזה, אבל עברנו את פרעה, נעבור גם את זה. יצאנו לשתות, למחוץ את הראש, על הדלפק פגשנו את מינה בני ושוש, אהלן על הכיפק, אבל המשכנו לחרוש, דלפק שני שוב מינה בני ושוש, דלפק שלישי ושלוש, את מי יכולנו לפגוש, כך זה חוזר, אבל עברנו את פרעה, נעבור גם את זה. הסתובבתי קצת זמן ללא מטרה וללא הגדרה וללא פשרה, איבדתי גובה וקצת הכרה, חשבתי אולי בכל זאת הגדרה שתיתן תשובה חד משמעית וברורה, נקראתי על זה, אבל עברנו את פרעה, נעבור גם את זה. ועכשיו אני תקוע בזמן החדיש, ולמען האמת אני די אדיש, המצב אמנם בישך איני מרגיש, אין לי לב לכל החומר שהמרקם מגיש, ושלטון העם שוב יורד אל הכביש, ואני מתבזה. אבל עברנו את פרעה, נעבור גם את זה. תראו חברים, לא מכל דבר אני באמת סובל. לא תמיד אני יודע מה כן ובמה זה גובל. אני בדרך כלל אוהב לשמוע אנשים מדברים, אבל לפעמים אני פשוט מתפוצץ כשהם פולטים את כל השטויות שלהם. אני ממש כזה, אבל עברנו את פרעה, אז נעבור גם את זה. אני יודע, תראו, יש לפעמים מצבים, אתם יודעים, שבן אדם פוגש בן אדם והם מחליפים דעות, ולפני שאתה יודע מי ומה הם מסתייפים, ולפני שאתה יודע מה ומי, אז אני שואל את עצמי, מה בעצם יוצא לי מכל זה? אבל עברנו את פרעה, כן? אז נעבור גם את זה, חברים. תראו חברים לך, מה אתם חושבים לעצמכם? מי יכול לקחת את כל זה? מי יכול לעשות את זה? הנוכחות הזאת של הזולת עם העמדה האחרת שלו, הוא לא חושב כמוני. הרי הייתי יכול לשפוך את דמו. אז באמת לפעמים זה צועק, זה מתפוצץ בחזה. כן, אבל עברנו את פרעה, נעבור גם את זה. לא, אני בעד חיי משפחה, אין ספק בזה. אני אוהב אישה, אני אוהב ילדים, אני אוהב עוזרות, אני אוהב נהגים, אני אוהב חייט, אני אוהב תופרת, אני אוהב גנן שיודע לנגן על הכלי הזה. אבל עברתי אני את פרעה, אעבור גם את זה. Now let me give it to you in English. Sometimes in the future I'm gonna come good.